Hello, everyone. This is Tom Fox, and I'd like to welcome you to this episode and welcome back Jim Massey. Jim, first of all, welcome and thank you so much for taking the time to visit with me yet again.
It's my pleasure. I enjoy our time together.
So, Jim, since the last time we visited on a podcast, you have published a book entitled Trust in Action. So, I'll ask you if you would be willing to talk about that, and you were kind enough to do so. Before we get going, could you remind the audience of your professional background and your current role when you're not publishing books?
Absolutely. And Tom, I think for your audience in particular, I always like to start off that I view myself as a behavioralist. I started out in politics, moved into consumer marketing, but I spent almost 15 years in compliance. And it was there that I really started to understand as a behavioralist, I've been trying to change human behavior, but I wanted to start doing it for good. And then I moved into compliance and converted a global compliance team into a global sustainability team focused on the environmental social governance work. Compliance was in the governance part. And I always say I've been focused the last 7, 8 years of my career on changing human impact for good in both permanence and results in the world. And so that's a background. I'm currently the chief sustainability officer for Xi Laboratory, a global biotech company. And that's what I'm doing when I'm not publishing books. And publishing books is just a small portion of my time.
We're going to make that a big portion of your time for the next 30 minutes or so. Okay, trust in action. I can't think of a more ubiquitous topic for business. And probably the thing that intrigued me the most about your book and this book is you see business as a solution to a much bigger problem. But let's start off with why this book and why now?
I think I've been sitting back listening that as society, we're losing trust in our systems. These systems are things, everything from government, depending on where you are regionally, education, religious institutions, and even business. And so, though business is losing, or society is losing trust in business, it's still the most trusted entity, with 61% of people saying they trust business. But then, Tom, the fascinating thing for me was when the research by Edelman went further, and Pew also has the Pew Family Institute also has similar research. When they interviewed employees, the number jumped up to almost 75, 78% of employees said they trusted their business to do the right thing. And so for me, that's why I believe organizations, they're driven by profits. They're still wanting to look at making money for their shareholders, keeping employees happy, the supply chain, customers happy. I believe business can be a force for good when we are focused and wanting to do that. And that's where I still have hope in business.
So, why is showing trust in leadership so important in your opinion?
I think for me, what it boils down to, trust is the basic of any human interaction. I think an important thing, Tom, is I view these systems that we as society we're losing trust in. The irony for me is they're built by humans for humans. It's our way to try to make sense of the chaos that we experience in the natural system. And ironically, what I always say is we cause the problem, therefore I believe we can be the solution. So by creating these built systems, we as humans within these systems can solve them. So who's going to do that? Leaders. And I believe it's those who've been anointed with title, but I also believe it's each one of us as participants in these systems being involved, being aware. And though we may be losing trust in the system, we can never lose trust in ourselves. And that for me is the caveat of why I wrote the book. Earlier I didn't answer the question. You said, why now? I believe we are facing so many challenges across so many different topics. We need each and every human focused on where they can be having the greatest impact so that we all aren't trying to solve the same problems because we just won't get that done if that's the case. So I feel the important part about this book and this point in time is each of us, we are a leader. And as leaders, we must find where we can have our greatest impact, and we've got to start making that impact today.
You touched on this a little bit earlier when you cited the statistics around both trust in corporations and employees' trust in their own corporations. But why are businesses so uniquely suited to help address this issue on literally a worldwide basis?
I think it has to do with scope. As we continue to see, and this is one of the phenomenons that are forcing people to have question and doubt in government, right? But there was a time world powers were trying to influence other countries. And now we start to see as the tensions are rising, the geopolitical issues are there, governments are looking more inward. And when they look inward, there's polarization taking place. What's still going beyond geography is climate as well as business, especially multinational organizations. And even when you think about the UN that was established to help countries operate, they created the UN Global Compact, which was for businesses to be operating within the governmental systems. So the reason I believe business is still there is business understands the needs and the roles of society, I think, as well, if not better than government. But then also, Tom, there's something called Martek's law that says on if you look at the rate of change and the rate of adaptability, technology is so fast. So we can talk about this in a little bit, but let's just take AI. Officially launched last October, ChatGPT, and now my kids are using it in their classroom. So in less than 6 months, the world has drastically changed there. So technology is changing faster than anything. We as individuals can adapt faster than business. Business can adapt faster than government regulations. So for me, we as individuals need to lead, but also business needs to, because simply regulations are not catching up. And we saw that play out in the US Congress last week when they were saying you let social media take off and it's harmed society. How are you going to control this AI? And the fact of the matter is, we are so polarized. That same week, we saw Republican and Democrat arguing over whether someone should be stepping down from Congress. We are not in a place to be creating regulations to protect humanity from AI. So business and individuals must be stepping up.
So why, and equally importantly, how should a leader take action to have the greatest impact?
One of the things I love about this title, Tom, is I love words, right? My mom taught folklore. My wife's a journalist. Words matter to me. And so the irony is I'm focused on trust. We as society need to see trust in action, but also sometimes trust may not exist. And so we must trust in action itself. And I was raised in a family where action beats inaction every time. And so for me, leaders must be able to assess a situation, be about 10,000 feet above the details to see the whole picture, see really what's going on. And then I also think leaders have that unique opportunity to collect dots and not just connect them. And so when you see something happening, and there may be 20 various topics that people want you to address, leaders need to be laser focused. One of my favorite statements is priority was never meant to be plural. So as leaders, it's our responsibility to understand what is our priority, where can we make the greatest impact, and how can we garner the resources to make that impact. A perfect example to get very tangible, I work in life sciences. We are a healthcare company. We have very limited carbon footprint. So we're not in extraction, we're not in agriculture, we're not in shipping. Those are the big industries that need to be looking to really shape shift what carbon footprint and greenhouse gas emissions look like. We have to focus on health, another major crisis going on around the world. And so when companies and leaders focus where they can have their greatest impact, it frees us up. The companies that are causing greenhouse gas emissions, solve that. I've got health. And as we start to divide up and conquer the biggest tasks, where we can have our greatest impacts, where we are the experts, that's how we're going to accomplish and tackle so many of the things coming at us all at once.
Jim, what's the trust model for sparking action?
So when I was writing my book, I interviewed a lot of people, had a lot of conversations, and the model I created for myself was rooted in research and some of the brightest people writing books on trust. But they had a 9-step process or a 6-step, or one even got down to 4. As a classically trained consumer marketer and behavioralist, I know we remember things in odds and we prefer 3s. So I took a lot of this information and I boiled it down to can, care, do, a simple model that you can oscillate through at any time. But Tom, one of the fascinating things when I was researching and talking to people, time and time again, people try to simplify trust down to this concept. Do people do what they say they will? That, no surprising, is the do part of my simplified model. But there's more to it than just action. There's heart and mind, right? Is someone capable? Can they do it? And do they care? And those are things that sometimes can be symptomatic of someone's actions, But sometimes a leader may not know what they don't know, and they may not have the capability to walk the walk that they're being asked to. So the can, care, do are the three building blocks of trust that I say are always going through and always need to be evaluated. If action's not happening, if there's ever confrontation or conflict within two people or a team, a leader needs to be nimble enough to be running through to decipher what is the major issue, what's the priority for the trust factor. Is it can, care, or do?
So, could you give us an example of the trust factor in a business context?
Yeah, and I'll get pretty personal on this one. I was asked to run the global health team at a biopharmaceutical company. And of course, I said yes. I'd already transformed multiple functions before, so I could do it again. I started thinking this is a global company. There's a major bias towards fat Americans, especially in healthcare. And guess what, Tom? I was a morbidly obese American getting ready to run a global health team. I did not feel authentic doing that. So, though I said yes because I knew I had the innovation and the passion and everything else, I had to go check myself on my ability to be healthy. So, I started working with a dietitian. I shed 90 pounds. And so as I started to lose my weight and understand this, I was able to start having different action with my team. They were focused on the wrong aspects of the global health program. I realized it was as much about the food we put in our bodies. So we started focusing on subsidizing healthy options in our canteens, more so than just giving more training on move. Because you can move as much as you want, but if we're serving bad food in our own cafeterias, we as a company are not fulfilling our commitments to our employees to give them the best options available. So that was one example where I had to transform myself in the can aspect so I could show I cared to the company I was trying to transform. And then ultimately in our actions, we were able to start doing and increasing not only movement, but giving better options in our cafeteria. But I first had to transform myself to transform the team to transform the enterprise.
Diet and exercise. Who knew?
Dad gummit.
So, how do you take this concept out on a global basis? You mentioned, the fat Americans, but what about the ugly Americans or the perception that the Americans are just going to do what they want to do and it doesn't apply to our culture and you name the place?
Yes, it's happened multiple times for me. I represent what I call the 17 dimensions of predominant power. Everything from Western civilization, being born in the US, right? I live on a coast. I live in Washington, D.C. area. I have stature, all these things. So when I travel, I scream kind of American. I'm 6'4". You can hear from my voice. English is my only language, and I'm even right-handed. So all things, about me scream Americans are going to do what they want. When I go abroad, Tom, I focus heavily on care, which is the concept, do people understand that I have their best interest at heart? And often it's acknowledging that when I was working in low to middle income countries, and I would have better Wi Fi in that region than I did in Washington, D.C. And I was working with a minister of health for a country, and they're like, what can we do to replicate the West? I could show I had their best interest at heart and say, don't do what we did. Just as you've done in Wi Fi, go mobile first in healthcare. I was talking about mobile first in these low to middle income countries before we had teledoc here in the United States. So it's about understanding the region in which you're going and trying not to replicate and having the vulnerability to understand we don't have all the answers. I think, Tom, that's the most important part about trust in action is subject matter expertise has gone by the wayside for me. I think the best leaders are those who have learning agility, who have the humility to understand we're facing problems we've never faced before, so none of us have the solution. And so I'm looking for people who aren't beholden to what was and are only thinking about what can be. And then I learn from them and using my learning agility, adapt to the situation. That helps me establish trust quickly, even if I'm not in the native tongue, because I'm asking for solutions that they think of and not telling them as the Western savior.
So, you gave us an example of a personal example of trust in action. Could you move that example out to a corporation? How you've seen trust either as a leader engaging in it, but perhaps in another way as well to really drive some part of organizational change?
Yeah. I think I can go broader, right? Because the model of trust for me, Tom, sits at self, team, and system. And one of the things I always talk about is self, team, and system can move up and down the grade scale. So sometimes the self can be a company, and I think my impression is that's a question you're asking me here. So how have I seen a leader transform a company to transform an industry to transform the world? And being in life sciences, the first thing I want to think about are the Modernas, the Pfizers, the Johnson and Johnson, the AstraZeneca during COVID. No one was looking at vaccines in those spaces. And we saw companies on a dime change their culture. At the time, I was at AstraZeneca and I had many colleagues working there. I also worked at Johnson and Johnson. I learned firsthand how CEOs were helping shift resources. Leaders at senior levels were raising their hands saying, I've never done this, but I think I can help. And we saw an industry transform itself, one that many thought the pharma industry was bad, but they started to prove that understanding science, understanding their area, they were able to get vaccines out at an unbelievable rate and able to open the world back up. So that's one of my favorite examples of where I saw multiple CEOs partnering, because in the past it was always competitive, but the collaboration within the biopharmaceutical industry to get the vaccine out along with government entities as well is one of the best examples of where we saw people almost blindly trusting that they could do this, and they delivered time and time again.
So, one of the most prescient comments I heard coming out of the pandemic is we move from recovery to business resiliency to literally business as usual. And by that, the person who said that to me meant now there's no such thing as black swan. There's no such thing as an unknown disaster. There's just the next challenge. Can we use the strategies you've articulated to literally meet a series of challenges 2 years ago we might not have never envisioned? But, and I'm going to pick on China just because it's front of mind. 2 years ago, I don't think business people were concerned about a conflict with China. Now they are. Can you use the strategies you've talked about from the business perspective to help us navigate that issue?
I believe we can. And it's why I wrote it. It's why taking a simple model just to help people real time. Because, Tom, even I hear on a regular basis, just here in the US, and this may be political because I think here in the US, most topics are. But every morning I hear, once again, America finds itself with a mass shooting, or once again, we find America with horrible fires or bad storms. And I think, Tom, we're seeing societies begin to catch up with we are seeing catastrophe after catastrophe, man made, non man made. But I would even argue the devastating storms we see are man made. And that's why I always differentiate between the built system and the natural systems that exist. So when you talk about the geopolitical situations we find ourselves in between China, the US, Russia, the Ukraine, we see multiple things playing out on a regular basis globally, but we also see them locally. We see them in division of families. We see them in division of work. And it's starting to show up more and more at work where employees are pressuring organizations take a stance, don't take a stance. And people are having to calibrate stakeholders on a regular basis. So for me, for 25 years, I've been using the can, care, do model as an executive within organizations. And it always helps me navigate. So there are times, depending on what it may be geopolitical, okay, so what do I need to understand on the complexity of what's happening here? Let's take ESG, my area of expertise. We are seeing an increase of European investors using proxies at corporate meetings to drive in the US to drive topics of climate and human rights. But then here in the US, we see polarization of the parties where the red states are saying no ESG, that's evil. The blue states are saying, and cities are saying, if you want to operate here, we need to see more. A key part of that is doing due diligence on your supply chain. And we just had some articles posting coming out of China that China feels due diligence is the Western view of spying on China operations. That's hecka complex, Tom. If you're a global company trying to navigate. So just always understanding what is it. And for me, ESG is just another business risk today. And so it's always evaluating the risk itself, putting in the right controls and mitigations. And for me, it's going between can, care, do on a regular basis. Before I can go and do any particular item, I need to understand the complexity of the stakeholders I'm dealing with. And that may go everywhere from bringing in the right experts to the right law firms. Once I understand what I can do, then I need to understand what are the impacts I'm trying to have. How do I influence with humanity at work for my stakeholders, whether it's the governments I'm dealing with, the shareholders, or the employee base? How do I continue to communicate and inform? This is how we as a company are operating to the best of our abilities, and then take action to do so. And so it's just a constant evaluation of the three foundations of trust, because I do believe there's truth in every stakeholder I just shared with you. And that gets very complex.
Jim, let me change the focus just a little bit to your writing style. How long did it take you to write this book?
So it's interesting. I wrote two books simultaneously. And so I had one in the works. It's a personal one with my family. This one took me just shy of 6 months. And to demystify, I engaged a ghostwriter to help me. And for me, it was a big part of I knew the model, I knew what I wanted, and I had the outline sitting on my desk for almost a decade, Tom. But between demands of my life's work, whether it's my current job, raising two game changers, maintaining my partner and I's relationship, and doing what we do. The family loves to travel. We have a family travel book coming out at the end of this summer. So there were multiple things. So I would write and engage a ghostwriter to help create, and then I had final editing.
So, did you have a time of day you wrote? Did you do it catch as catch can? Do you have a particular part of the day that you feel you're more inspirational or more a game ish?
Yes. And it's interesting for me, the ideas creation was always audio. I am a verbal processor and I am a fantastic editor. So, with a mom as a teacher of folklore, I learned it's easier to edit than it is to create. For me, that meant I had to have spoken word. So often what I would do on my daily movement, every day I try to get out into nature and I try to touch soil, grass, and bark. And so I'm often on trails. And so I'd use memos to record myself. And then I would bring it home and transcribe. And then I'd take those notes and work with my ghostwriter to think about where we want to go next. And then from there, the ghostwriter would get the final outline. And then on Saturdays is often when I would do it. Saturday mornings, I love to get up before sunrise. That for me is where I'm at my best and best energy. And so Saturdays were when I would take pen to editing paper virtually and just go into the documents and edit.
Well, after the family travel book, do you have another business book in your heart, soul, or in your head?
Yes. And my publishing coach has this wonderful statement that every human has a book that wants to come out. It's just whether we accept it or not. And so I have a couple in mind. I think for me, one topic that I always talk about is, as a leader, one way I learn as a verbal processor is I talk to others. And so I go back in middle school, I never sat at the same table. I'd always rotate around. I remember a high school counselor said, I'm always fascinated to see, I always walk in and I never see you at the same table. And that was just a lesson I learned early in my life, is it's important to change tables up. So as an executive, I always made sure when I went into our cafeteria, I would ask if I would go and look for someone sitting by themselves. I'd always ask, is this seat open? So I have a draw for a book called Is This Seat Open? Learning from Those Who Aren't Like Me. Or ultimately the title would be, Is This Seat Open? What happens when the white guy leaves his own table? So
Well,
that's definitely going to be next.
Jim, unfortunately, we're near the end of our time for this episode. But before we leave, if our listeners wanted any more information on yourself, your book, or any of the topics, where should they go?
So you want to get my book, go to Amazon. It's there. It's probably the easiest, fastest way. If you'd like to engage with me, I'm on LinkedIn as Jim Massey. And then I also have a website, www.jimmassey.co.
Well, Jim, I wanted to thank you again for taking the time to visit with me, and I look forward to continuing this conversation.
Always, Tom. Thanks for having me.